Welcome back, everybody. This is not a Malazan video per se. This is something that I wanted to do for a while, which is to talk about secret police and torture representation in fantasy books. So expect spoilers from the Malazan Book of the Fallen up to and including Reaper's Gale, well, mostly Reaper's Gale anyway. Also expect spoilers from the first Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, and expect spoilers for Nightwatch by Terry Pratchett. That being said, this is a serious topic I know way too little about to actually talk about, but that's never stopped me before, so let's do this. Cheers. Still, what I wanted to do is, since torture and some type of Inquisition or secret police has been a part of a bunch of like fantasy books over the years, I wanted to look at how those different books portray that kind of institution and its role or function within society, and what we can learn from that or not learn from that, or what that, just, mull over that for a while. So for this, I've picked Reaper's Gale by Stephen Erikson and the role of the Patriotists in that, especially Karos Invictat in that. I've picked the first Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie and the idea of, mostly the main character is Sand and Glocta, but probably also a bit Archlector Salt in there. And I've picked Nightwatch by Terry Pratchett and the role of Fine D. Swing as head of the secret police in that book. I could also include, I thought for a moment about including the Torturers Guild in Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, but I've decided against it because the way the Guild of the Torturers there is portrayed is very, very different from the other three, and I feel doesn't actually, compare well to the role of an actual secret police, which is more what I wanted to look at, which, means spies and the other stuff, whereas the Torturers Guild in Book of the New Sun doesn't do any of that. They just sit in their fortress and torture people according to the demands handed down by the ruler, the autarch. Anyway, still go and read Book of the New Sun because it's fabulous, but I feel it doesn't really fall into what I wanted to look at here. So the way I want to go through this is by giving a rough outline of each of those three secret police, like groups of secret police, which would be the Unmentionables within the Nightwatch, the Patriotists on Reaper's Gale, and obviously the Inquisition with the First Law. Give a short description of how their function or the way they are show up in the books, and then I'll try to look at some differences and things they have in common and see if we can actually draw any conclusions from that afterwards. So that's sort of how I want to go through this. So let's start with Terry Pratchett, actually. All right, so Nightwatch by Terry Pratchett is one of the relatively late Discworld novels. It's one of my favorites. I will give a short plot summary, synopsis kind of thing here. But in general, you should go and read that book if you haven't, because it's one of the best, probably one of the most serious and dark Discworld novels. And it basically has a time travel frame narrative, and within that, one of the main characters is dropped into a time and place where the overall police is corrupt. I mean, the City Watch is very corrupt, but there's another branch which is called the Unmentionables or Particulars, and they are basically used to enforce discipline. They spy out rebels, they torture a lot of people, and so forth. So that's our first way of looking at that. And during the story, they play a role, and I don't want to go too deeply into that here, but the main idea here is that that you have basically your overt police force, which would be in that case obviously the City Watch, and you have these a specific unit, so to speak, a specific police force dedicated to rooting out treachery and using torture to do that. They are run by someone called Find the Swing. Find the Swing because it's Terry Pratchett and he has to do jokes. It doesn't very well though. And who is, by all appearances, he's described as a madman. I'm not going to go into that right now, but he is certainly someone who uses what you might call phrenology. Is it phrenology? The idea of looking at the shape of a head to describe to deduct if someone is a criminal or not. He uses that, but they also employ torture, and it is during the story it is implied that the actual torturers are rather simple, brutal people who just like to hurt people, other people for money because they are like emotionally stunted and they just don't care. The don't caring bit, I feel, is an important part here. We'll come back to that later. So that's the basic structure is you have that one person. And the idea, obviously, of using facial features or generally like the shape of the head and other parts to judge character is something that was used or cooked up in, I think, France in the 19th century. And was a real idea of doing stuff. It luckily faded again because it's utter bullshit. But I guess what is important here is it's not like the way it is depicted is not as just like madness, but it's taken serious by the people that run that organization, not the Patriotists, the Particulars or Unmentionables, as they are mostly called. I'll stick with Unmentionables because it's more fun. So it's taken serious, and they use pseudoscience to decide whether someone is a criminal or a traitor or not. Which, once again, I feel is important to look at later on. So those are the way it runs in this specific Discworld story. They obviously operate under a corrupt rule. There's obviously, if you have not read any Discworld novels, the city of Ankh-Morpork is run by an autocrat called the a sort of semi-benign tyrant, the Patrician. And in this story, the Patrician is rather corrupt, possibly also mentally ill, at least paranoid. But, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, and there's certainly people after him as well. So there's that. It's a corrupt government exploiting the populace, taking as much, like, it's a corrupt government taking as much taxes from the poor populace as possible, and the organization of the Particulars is basically used to keep civil unrest in check because of the way they operate to spread fear and maybe sometimes actually catch so-called traitors as well and rebels as well. So that's something we find there. All right, let's now add a second one. Look for a moment at the Inquisition in the First Law Trilogy. And oh boy, they suck. Now, obviously, the name Inquisition is one of those things that crops up a lot in fiction. And the Inquisition has a bad name in general in today's like general mindset with people who have not studied a lot of medieval history. Point is, you have two different kinds of Inquisition there, right? You have the Holy Inquisition from, say, the 13th century onwards. It was put into place in the 1250s at the Third Lateran Council, I feel. Might have been the fourth. I don't know. It's definitely the one, yeah, in the 1250s. And then you have what is usually what most people think about nowadays is, and I guess you won't expect this, the Spanish Inquisition. Now, those are two different things in a way. And the Catholic Inquisition of the High Middle Ages was used to root out heresy, which was a serious issue at the time, or heterodoxy at the time. But, and this is important there, the Inquisition, the medieval Inquisition, was sort of the first time the hunt for heretics and mostly heterodox believers, and thus heretics, is the first time that was actually put into strict rules to actually reduce the amount of torture used, to actually formalize the whole thing and make it more than just one madman killing people, like our good friend Conrad from Marburg, who certainly killed a lot of people before they banded together to kill him. But that's a different story. Point is, the Inquisition at the time in the 1250s was very much a step forward and made the whole idea of, like, the whole concept of looking for heresy a much more humane and orderly thing. I'm not saying that's good, like, I'm not saying that's perfect or anything. I'm just saying that between no Inquisition and the idea of the Inquisition in the High Middle Ages, that's what you might call progress, actually. Now, the Spanish Inquisition is another thing that was very much closer to what we now have in mind when we talk about Inquisition, which is very much about willfully just choosing whoever you like, choosing rich people, taking their money, hunting down mostly like Jews and other non-believers as well. And it's a more sordid thing. They're also much bigger on torture, apparently, but I am not an expert on the Spanish Inquisition. So I'm going to leave it at that and just say, like, be aware that there's a difference. Now, obviously, nowadays, the whole idea of Inquisition has been muddled by media, by all kinds of media. The whole, like, what's her name? The whole, like, Jeanne d'Arc story has been obviously in a lot of media turned into a dark picture of the Inquisition, although there was a lot of other stuff going on at the same time that is more political, and I'm not going to go into that as well. But, you know, we have a very dark picture of the Inquisition, which is, I guess, also, like, you know, Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco is another one of those pieces of media that depicts the Inquisition as a rather stupid, brutal organization that delights in torture and is corrupt through and through. Which, you know, it actually isn't, or wasn't at the time. So there's that. Anyway, when we look at the First Law Trilogy, the organization of the Inquisition is one part of the government and is used to root out treason, although treason can be anything that they want to look at. So there's no real structures. They can just, like, do like pick people from the streets and torture them to get at their confession, and then ideally take part of their money and so forth for the king. But there's also corruption in there, so it's much more of a loose kind of version of it. It's like everything within the First Law Trilogy. It's painted in very broad strokes, and we readers are forced to or expected to fill in all the details by our assumptions from wherever we're drawing them. But in general, there is no idea. Basically, you have a monarchy, the king, and you have the Inquisition, whose job it is to root out traitors and protect the country and protect the state, basically what you might call a secret police or secret service for like internal stuff. You know, yeah, your average like secret service basically, which works well. But then because this is the first law, everyone is corrupt as fuck, so they are like doing their own thing, trying to wage because it kind of depicts these dark aspects of any kind of you know corruption, power struggle within the executive branch of any kind of government, where all these different organizations are fighting for power against each other and are corrupt and dark, because that's just how the first law works. And there's obviously a lot of cynicism in there. We also know that they are torturing to get false confessions, to achieve political things and so forth, which, yeah, that's something that has happened quite a lot and probably still happens a lot depending on which country you go to force confessions by torture and so forth. But once again, torture is a major aspect of the whole thing, and because this is the first law and it was all about being edgy at the time, we get a lot of that torture in a very explicit form, presented in a rather explicit way. So there's that. Now we look at for a quick moment, we look at how it's portrayed in Reaper's Gale. In Reaper's Gale by Stephen Erikson, obviously. And in Reaper's Gale, we have in the Empire of Letheras, we have the organization of the Patriotists, who are at least on first glance and by their mandate, an organization. I don't even know if it's actually just formed after the occupation or not. So basically, the Kingdom of Letheras, the Empire of Letheras, has been conquered by the Tist Edur, who are supposed to be in charge over their human underlings, or the conquered original Letheri. And the Patriotists are a Letheri organization to root out treason or rebellion and treachery, root out treason within the Letheri populace for their Edur overlords, which obviously is not how this works. We already know that. So basically the problem is that the Patriotists are Letheri. They are an organization set up by the at least officially conquered Letheri to police themselves. They are obviously, together with the economic branch of this supposedly conquered country, secretly running the place, and are mostly motivated by economic necessity, by greed. Basically, it's all about gaining money, because that's how that works. They use their also mostly fabricated confessions, fabricated crimes, to enrich themselves, in company with the economic branch of the state, basically, which is called the Liberty Consign, because that's how that kind of thing works. They are run by someone called Karos Invictad, who uses a lot of childhood humiliation and all of these things that drive him to prove to himself and the world that he is actually a genius and able to manipulate the whole of human nature and human society. They imply torture. They imply what an idiot I am. They employ torture to get their way, but they also use average, intimidation tactics, spread false rumors, the whole gamut that you get from a secret police or secret service. So yeah, those are basically the rough outlines. Yeah, I kind of forgot to mention when it comes to the Inquisition in the First Law that one of our main viewpoint characters is Sandan Glocta, who was tortured himself and has turned into a torturer now. And the head of the Inquisition is someone called Archlector Salt, who is something of a fascist, but also a fascist. Yeah, he's a fascist on a power trip, and he wants to. Yeah, he's mostly trying to gain power for himself to turn the country into a very conservative, if not, yeah, fascist place. He's very much a romantic and so forth when it comes to history and mythology and shit like that. All right, so there's those three different ways to portray the secret police slash Inquisition, or however you want to call that gang of thugs that's used to keep the people in check. All right, now let's look at what we can see, what they all have in common, and what they maybe have not in common, and what we can tell from that and tell from that. All right. What we can see, what they all have in common is that they are organizations unto themselves. They are all three run in these books by individuals who are very, at least slightly eccentric, to put it mildly. We can see with Karos and Victad his slow descent into like further madness from just being like deluded to like full-on madness during the story. We see the power trip that Archlector Salt is on go to extremes during the story, from just being an arrogant, rather conservative asshole to, yeah, something of a madman. And with Find the Swing, we don't see any like development. He's already eccentric at the beginning, and at the end of his so-called arc, I mean, we don't see much of him. He just remains the same. Although, and I feel this is something that needs to be pointed out, that when we come to the differences, yeah, I'll talk about it when we come to the differences. What else do they have in common? They all employ torture and intimidation tactics. It's very much about either beating up people in the streets or snatching people from the streets and torturing them. Which, yeah, is something that is rather realistic when it comes to secret police in general. So we have that in common. There is an element of corruption within two of those, which is the Patriotists in Reaper's Gale and the, what they called, the Inquisition in the First Law, where while there is corruption and embezzlement on a large scale in Nightwatch, it is not directly linked to the Unmentionables, who are really just a tool of that economic elite that is exploiting and the city, basically. So we don't learn about corruption within the Unmentionables at all. So there might have been some, probably there is, but the corrupt parts are the regular police and not the secret police there. Although it is implied that they probably don't target powerful people within, you know, the society of Ankh-Morpork there. That is implied, but never like mentioned fully. So those are like the great like things they have in common. So let's look at some other aspects. One thing that I should probably mention here is that the writing styles of all three authors are obviously very, very, very different. Where Terry Pratchett paints rather, I don't want to say in broad strokes, but Terry Pratchett's writing style is not focused onto a lot of details unless he really needs them to. There's not a lot of world building going on here in Discworld, at that point at least, in this novel. And the novel is obviously much shorter than the other two. Like It's a standalone novel. It's, I don't know, 250, 300 pages, something like that. Whereas the other two are a trilogy of, all in all, I don't know, a couple of thousand pages. And Reaper's Gale itself is probably also roughly 1,000 pages long. So they, our authors there, have a lot more pages to actually get into the nitty gritty of things. So Pratchett does not, give us all these details. He just uses a very few distinct scenes to paint us a picture of torture and of torturers. And, that's just one way to go about it. Then obviously, Joe Abercrombie's writing style is a rather cynical, dry-humored, dark-humored way of writing in terse sentences, having this nihilistic look at the world that you get in all of his stories, and that heavily, shades the depiction of the Inquisition in a very specific way. You don't get a realistic depiction of things with Joe Abercrombie. That's not his point. You get a cynical view at things, and that's obviously the same here with the Inquisition. Now the question is, obviously later on, what do you get from depicting a corrupt organization bent on torture? What do you get by actually depicting it cynically as and as opposite from just depicting it realistically? Do you actually gain something from that or not? But that's a different question for later on. And Stephen Erikson obviously has a very, I don't want to say a Baroque writing style because it shifts so much over the series, but he certainly depicts characters in enough detail to give them a rather faceted personality. They're almost personality studies of specific people in a specific situation. So we get a rather, I don't want to say realistic, but real seeming depiction of how such an organization would work. And while there is obviously also judgment on whether such an organization is good or not within Stephen Erikson's work there, it is not as cynically and nihilistically tinted at this point as it is in The First Law, because that's not how Stephen Erikson writes his books. Although we get some rather strong language later on how the Patriotists work, including the fact that they are actually called fascists, and that the word fascism is actually mentioned there several times, something that we don't see within the other two, for different reasons, I suspect. All right. Now let's have us a look at the use of torture and the depiction of torturers within these three books. For one, I'll go through them like one after the other again. So with Discworld and Nightwatch, there is basically one scene where it's actually talked a little bit about the torture going on with the Unmentionables, and that's one torturer at least. I mean, we don't get any of his personal views or anything. We just get actually a clever description where it is that when they actually unmask the torturer, it's like, yeah, he knew the face, not the person, but the face. It's one that he saw, that you see every day. That's that whole like banality of evil, and the idea that like for enough money, us humans are willing to do all kinds of things and switch off our brain and commit cruelty and commit violence. It's just a matter of price, and there's always some people for whom that price is very, very, very low. Which is sort of the approach that Terry Pratchett took there. It's depicted as an organization just like every other organization. It needs people to do brutal things, and we will always find such people. it's important to make sure that it's clear that those people working there are not portrayed as sadists or taking pleasure in their work. There is the implication. No, not even that. So yeah, that's the way Terry Pratchett looks at it, which seems a rather, I guess it's sort of implied or informed by the kind of philosophical background that he sometimes has. And as I said, like the banality of evil is sort of what you can see within that. And it's something that shows up again from time to time within Discworld novels in general, that evil does not come with an eccentric personality or anything. Evil, or the sheer stupid, mindless evil, comes with all kinds of people all the time. That's something that we can see there, and it sort of gives us a hint on what kind of outlook the author there has, or what kind of outlook you can have on humanity as a whole, the human condition or human nature, and society. Now, it gets kind of a bit more difficult with the idea of torture in the First Law. There it is very clear that torture is used to get the confessions that people want. Now, it's clear with all three in the end, it's very clear that torture will always get the result that the torturer wants, because sooner or later people will just confess to end the pain. But it's very clear within the First Law that this is used cynically to actually create the idea that there is treason to continue working and so forth. It is cynically manipulated and used from the top to achieve very specific results, political results. That's what you get in the First Law, because that's how the First Law world in general operates. It is also rather clear that at least some of the torturers that are portrayed have a sadistic streak in them. Others have just a lot of rage that they then take out there. It's not exactly so. But the torturers that are shown, at least some of them, or quite a few of them, are depicted in a way where it is clear that them choosing the job of torturer is rooted in their personality, and they at least enjoy that. There's one character where it's pretty clear that he's not that kind of guy, which I would say is Practical Frost. With him, it seems to be very, he just doesn't care. So he's the closest, I guess, to the type of torturer that you get in the Night Watch. Another thing that I found at least slightly problematic, or something worthwhile noting here, is that all the torturers within that book are very eccentric human beings. They're described in the ways like, one of them is, Practical Frost is an albino. They're usually people from somewhere. They're all depicted as the other, is what I'm trying to say here. And I find this problematic. Up to a point, this is really problematic to depict all of them, except Practical Severard, who just seems to be a normal guy, a bit young, and a bit of a sadist, I guess. But the others are all depicted. I don't want to use the word freak here, but definitely that's sort of the way. It's even the way it is sometimes used. The word is sometimes even used in the depiction or the portrayal of them, or the description of some of those torturers within the stories. Whether it's the crippled and maimed Sandan Glokta as our viewpoint character, and first Inquisitor, and then later on Superior, and finally Archlector. Or it is his practicals, the albino, the huge Northman that's someone described as a dwarf. And I find this disturbing to use. It also kind of helps, I feel, in making them like dehumanize people who commit torture and not be aware or not admit that this is something that every human is, or not every human, but a lot of humans are able to do without any, previous damage to their minds, souls, or anything. So that's something that I would say is an unrealistic way to describe it, to just describe all of these people as somehow outsiders of society, somehow other. Now, when you finally go to the torturer and torturers within the Patriotists, there, once again, we have a rather complex, I guess, picture, where the torturers are definitely, or where the Patriotists definitely have motives of their own to pursue and have an agenda they pursue with their torture. It's also clear that people drawn to that job, at least some of the people drawn to that job, and I guess in this case that would mostly be Tana Yathwana, our like underling there. We have a rather complex character study of what makes him the kind of sadist he is. He seems to be a sadist. He is a sadist, but he's a rather complex character study. And if you want to talk more about that, know more about that, Claudia has made a very good video essay on his, I don't want to say relation, but his involvement or his behavior towards one female character within that story about power struggle and power relations and stuff like that. It's a very, very good video essay. I'll link it below. It's something worth talking about, definitely. Obviously, also Ruther Budd has made a video on Carus Invictat, and another one on Tanal Yathwana, or more like on Janath, which is his victim. I will link those as well to give you some more context on it. So yes, there is where it's clear that they also have their just share of basic thugs who are nothing special, and agents, spies, and so forth. Those we meet more closer, or get more information on, are described in are rather complex character studies. Although there's another one in there, Patriotist, which is Orban Truthfinder, who seems to be, apart from slightly obese, if I remember it correctly, is a rather cold, calculating person with no big personality issues whatsoever. He just is your average administrator and slightly spy and so forth. Once again, the type of cynical person doing that kind of job, but he's a cynic without real ambition. There's a slight level of xenophobia and racism in there, but that's basically with all Letheri humans towards the Tist Edur overlords. So that yeah, but he comes across as a rather average person basically, whereas his overlord Karos Invictat is getting progressively more insane throughout the story. All right, that's that. Now let's look at justifications, and let's look at justifications for their existence, or for the behavior of those organizations. With Terry Pratchett, it's rather simple. They, at least when it comes to justification, we have a point where Find the Swing is explaining why he's doing these things, and he's using the old terrible cop-out of history needs its butchers as well as its surgeons. He's what you might call something of a true believer. He really seriously believes that what he's doing there is correct, and that in certain situations the use of torture is necessary and fruitful. It is that aspect. So there's no real level of cynicism or hidden agenda of the secret police in there, which, when we come to the final discussion and conclusions, is important, I feel. Now, the next one is the Inquisition. Archlector Salt is justifying these things because it's like the ends justify the means. No, the other way around. No, the ends justify the means. And the end for him is to keep the Union a conservative place, well structured, where everyone knows their place and doesn't, start for reforms and so forth. It's what I said is like a national romanticism, conservatism, and on the border towards fascism is what I would call it in general. Which basically means that Archlector Salt, that is, justifies the actions of the Inquisition with the greater good of the state, but it is actually him deciding what that greater good of the state is. Something that we didn't find within the Discworld novel, within Nightwatch, where it is not find the swing captain of the Unmentionables who is deciding what the greater good is. He's just doing a job. It's a dirty job and someone has to do it, so he's doing it, and he's using his modern techniques to actually do it well, or so he thinks. Obviously he's not. Whereas with the Union and Archlector Salt, he has a very clear image of what the state should be and how the state should be organized, and he is using his organization to bring that about. So he still thinks he's doing this for the good of everybody, but it's actually his own good. In the final version, and that is the Patriotists, it's another thing entirely, because the situation described is a more complex one, with that conquered people and so forth. But in the end, apart from just being a megalomaniac, Karos Invictad has a rather clear-eyed picture of what he's doing. He obviously has his own agenda, combined with the combined with the agenda of the Chancellor, the Human Chancellor, and the Liberty Consign, the economic powers of it. But he is not above having his own, very, very personal agenda as well. And this basically what I'm trying to explain here is that we have 3 stages from a megalomaniac individualist who is using his power there to consciously gratifying his own greed, will for power, and a need for revenge against former imagined slights, which would be Karos Invictad. And on the other end of this whole continuum, you have Find the Swing, who is in his mind selflessly sacrificing his honor and so forth to fulfill the job that is needed, and with very little to no personal agenda. And in the middle, you have Archlector Salt, who has a very personal agenda, but is very much justifying it as being the best thing for the kingdom. And it's left open whether, how much he is aware that this is really just his idea. Now, obviously, we have another problem there with the end of the First Law Trilogy, that at the end Sandan Glokta becomes a new Archlector, and he has a very, very cynical view of it, because at this point he basically realizes that the entire kingdom is ruled basically by Bayaz, the first of the Magi, and the Inquisition is just one of those tools. So he will actually have to follow orders to move and shape the country in the way that his overlord, the wizard, wants to. So whether he wants that or not, the Inquisition under Sandan Glocta and thus Bayaz the First of the Magi is in the end another tool, and the personal convictions of the Archlector suddenly play less of a role, which kind of takes away a lot of the responsibility, or personal and moral responsibility of of the new Archlector. But that's another thing there. All right, so now we've looked at all these aspects. So let's look at how realistic they are, or what we can take from that. And there's, like, personally, I feel the approach that Joe Abercrombie takes the most problematic of the three. I am not sure whether, and I feel like the other two approaches are both different aspects or different facets of how secret police and torture are employed in what you might call authoritarian regimes in any case. Which is, on the one hand, the secret police and as just the strong arm of the authoritarian government. And this is being the case in Discworld. And on the other side, the secret police as part of, I don't want to say the military, but as part of as an active part or governing part of the authoritarian state or fascist state, which are just different ways of how this has played out within world history over the ages, basically. Sometimes the people, when you look at, I don't know, say the Soviet Union, where the whole secret police, whichever version they were at the time, was very much heavily involved in internal politics and internal power struggles within the regime, which would be more the patriotist side of it. And people running the Secret Service were always also people very much involved in the final government, in the actual government of the Soviet. The secret police being more involved in actual government, which is the way it is run in the Patriotists are run. On the other hand, you have the way which I feel seems to be more closely linked to a German fascist model, to sort of use a rough analogous, which is where you have the secret police being much more of a tool of the actual fascist regime, and not as heavily not quite as heavily involved in actual control or steering of the state as a whole, and more as a tool of oppression of the populace. Those, I feel, are the two realistic facets, with the middle one, the Union, the Inquisition of the Union, being once again a very cynical look at how the Inquisition or any secret police is just used to keep people down in this game that has been rigged from the start by the First of the Magi, Bayaz. Which, while giving us a cynical look at the world, doesn't actually let us take much away from it for our real world. The other part, I feel, is that Pratchett's point with the actual torture being done by just every man, because every man is able to do that for a specific price, and there's always enough people who do that for almost no price at all, because there's such people, but the banality of it is a very important aspect. And on the other hand, the idea that such a job and such a structure as the Patriotists or any kind of secret police or torture organization draws to it people with a specific personality, or the question where that personality comes from. That is sort of the strength of the Patriotists in Reaper's Gale. And I have considerable problems with the fact that most torturers within the the First Law trilogy are portrayed as as strangers, as either foreigners or people with severe outer or inner damage or aberrations in a way, which I find problematic because it basically, yeah, it makes them less human and thus kind of loses the point that it's the potential in almost all of us human beings to actually become very, very cruel and brutal and so forth. So, I mean, obviously this is not a video where I'm going to rank anything. I just felt it interesting to look at these three ways we portray torture and secret police within the fantasy genre. And yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter. What you think of it? Did I miss anything? Probably a lot. Is there one specific way it is portrayed that you personally prefer? Do you feel that tackling such a complicated and potentially like problematic subject as secret police and torture is something that should happen in fantasy stories, or do you think that should be left to either non-fiction or literary fiction outside of fantasy? Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you tomorrow about something else. Until then, cheers.